The air smelled of bruised iron and impending rain. Katie Lucas stood knee-deep in the freezing muck of her desolate field, her white-knuckled grip locked around the wooden handle of a rusty harvesting scythe. The sky above was a diseased, purple bruise, heavy with a storm that threatened to drown what little life remained in the borderlands. She raised her tired arm to wipe a smear of dirt from her hollow cheek, staring out at the barren earth that refused to yield. Then came the sound. Thwack! Wood splintered violently, showering the side of her neck with sharp fragments. A heavy, iron-tipped crossbow bolt vibrated furiously in the rotting timber of her cottage door, mere inches from where her temple had been a second before. A terrible silence followed, broken only by the cold wind howling through the dead grass. In the villages beyond the ridge, there is a whisper passed around tavern fires, a rumor that mercy died a long time ago in these lands, and that those who still practice it are either fools or soon to be corpses. If you've ever found yourself holding on to kindness in a world that only shows you cruelty, take a moment to subscribe and like this video, because you are going to want to see exactly what happens when a fool's mercy changes the course of an entire kingdom. Katie dropped to her knees, the freezing mud seeping instantly through her worn woolen skirt. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She waited in the sludge for the second shot. She waited for the thunder of horses, for the brutal shouts of marauders. But nothing came. Slowly, she turned her head, tracing the downward trajectory of the vibrating bolt embedded in her door. It hadn't been aimed at her. It had been a wild, desperate shot from the distant tree line, aimed at the heavy cluster of thick reeds near the edge of her property. Her every survival instinct screamed at her to crawl inside, bolt the door, and hide in the cellar until dawn, but the oppressive silence pulled her forward. Gripping her scythe like a weapon, Katie crawled on her hands and knees through the sludge until she parted the tall, dead grass. A massive figure lay face down in the mud. He was a mountain of a man, draped in a heavy, scavenged mercenary coat that reeked of wet wool and fresh copper. Protruding from his broad shoulder and lower back were two more crossbow bolts, their feathered fletchings slick with dark blood. Katie froze, the scythe trembling in her hands. She nudged his shoulder with the blunt wooden end of her tool. A low, ragged groan escaped him. He shifted, instinctively trying to push himself up, and rolled onto his side, exposing his face to the bruised sky. Katie gasped, stumbling backward. His face was entirely concealed. Strapped tightly across his features was a crude, heavy leather mask, the material darkened and soaked through with his own blood. There were no eye holes, only ragged slits for breathing, making him look less like a man and more like a slaughtered beast. He was dying. The bitter cold and the rapid blood loss would take him before the hour was out. Katie stared at the masked stranger, the biting wind whipping her dark hair across her tear-stained face. Why should she help him? Her own village treated her as a pariah, a cursed omen. When the sweating sickness swept through the valley 3 winters ago, it took her husband, her friends, and her meager livelihood. Because she had survived, utilizing her ancestral herbal lore to fight off the fever, the grieving, terrified villagers had branded her a plague widow, a witch who traded lives to save her own. They had driven her out here to rot in complete isolation. The world had shown her no mercy. It had only taken from her. She owed this brutal, bleeding borderland absolutely nothing. The man's massive hand twitched in the mud, his fingers curled, weakly grasping at the frozen earth, as if trying to hold on to life itself. The masked stranger let out a rattling breath that sounded entirely too human, entirely too broken. Katie closed her eyes, fighting a war within her own chest. If she let him die, she would be no better than the villagers who had abandoned her in her darkest hour. She was a healer. Dropping her scythe, Katie sank into the mud beside him. "Gods help me," she whispered. She grabbed the thick, soaked collar of his mercenary coat. The sheer weight of him nearly dislocated her shoulders, but desperation granted her a frantic, adrenaline-fueled strength. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged the massive, bleeding man through the muck. Her muscles screamed, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the first heavy, icy drops of rain began to fall from the purple sky. She hauled his heavy frame over the threshold of her decaying cottage, his boots leaving a thick trail of blood and mud on the floorboards. With a final desperate heave, she pulled him fully inside and slammed the heavy wooden door shut. She threw the iron deadbolt into place just as the storm violently broke, unleashing a torrential downpour against the roof. Katie sank to the floor, panting in the dim hearthlight, staring at the masked giant bleeding out on her worn rugs. She had just invited a hunted man into her home, completely unaware that the danger waiting outside in the storm was nothing compared to the identity of the man she had just locked inside with her. The heavy iron deadbolt slid into place with a resounding clack, sealing out the howling wind, but inside the dim cottage, the real battle was just beginning. Katie didn't waste another second staring at the bleeding giant on her floorboards. She threw off her soaked shawl and fell to her knees beside him, her hands moving with the frantic precision of a woman who had fought death before and lost. For 3 grueling days and nights, the storm raged, wrapping the desolate borderlands in a shroud of grey rain. And for 3 days, Katie did not sleep. She boiled willow bark to combat his rising fever and ground dried comfrey root and yarrow into thick, pungent poultices to pack the gaping holes left behind after she brutally, painstakingly extracted the iron bolts from his flesh. Throughout it all, the stranger remained trapped in a violent delirium. He thrashed against her worn quilts, his voice a gravelly, broken rumble as he shouted at ghosts. "The left flank! Hold the line!" he would gasp, his massive hands blindly gripping her wrists with bruising force. "Silas! The banner is down. They betrayed the banner." Katie wiped his burning forehead with a damp cloth, forcing drops of water past his chapped lips. Who was Silas? What battle was he reliving? The heavy leather mask remained strapped tightly to his face, the area around its edges red and swollen, but she dared not remove it yet, fearful of tearing the flesh beneath without proper salves. By the dawn of the 4th day, her jars of fever-few and blood-clotting moss were entirely empty. If she didn't get more supplies, the infection setting into the skin beneath his mask would boil into his brain. Leaving the stranger locked inside, Katie pulled her hood low and trekked through the biting chill toward the local village market. Oakhaven was a miserable settlement, a place of muddy streets and hollow-eyed people who watched her with a mixture of fear and contempt. As the plague widow, she kept her head down, trading 2 of her last precious turnips for a handful of dried herbs. The tense silence of the market was suddenly shattered by the thunder of heavy hooves. Katie shrank back against a wooden stall as a dozen armored mercenaries rode into the square, their horses kicking up freezing mud. At their head was Rolf, a notorious and brutal mercenary captain whose face was a map of old knife fights. He reined his massive warhorse in, his cruel eyes scanning the terrified, starving villagers. "Listen closely, you gutter rats!" Rolf bellowed, his voice echoing off the dilapidated taverns. "We are hunting an assassin, a coward who put 2 bolts into the back of George Noah, the Iron Duke." A collective, terrified shudder rippled through the crowd. Katie's breath hitched in her throat. The Iron Duke. Just the name felt like a curse on her tongue. He was the ruthless warlord who had levied the crippling grain taxes, plunging the region into the famine that had weakened her husband, making him vulnerable to the plague. The Duke's endless wars had bled the land dry. "The Duke is missing, and the assassin is bleeding in these woods," Rolf snarled, dismounting and grabbing a frail baker by the tunic, shoving him into the mud. Rolf's eyes darted through the crowd until they landed on Katie. He recognized her, the outcast, the woman who lived alone on the fringes. He released the baker and stalked toward her, the chainmail beneath his leather jerkin clinking menacingly. Rolf cornered Katie against the stall, his foul breath pluming in the cold air. "You wander the deep edges, witch," he hissed, leaning in close. "If you see the assassin out there in your bogs, or the Duke himself, run. He brings only death." Katie nodded frantically, her blood turning to ice. She clutched her small pouch of herbs to her chest and fled the market, her boots slipping in the mud as she ran all the way back to her cottage. "The Duke's men are scouring the woods," she panicked. "If they find a wounded man in my home, they will burn me alive." She threw open her cottage door, gasping for air. The fire in the hearth had dwindled to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. A terrible, wet, rattling sound filled the air. The stranger's fever had spiked aggressively in her absence. He was convulsing slightly, his skin burning to the touch. The dark leather mask was slick with a fresh, foul-smelling pus oozing from underneath its edges. The facial wound had festered. It was suffocating him. "Hold still, hold still," Katie whispered frantically, drawing her small, sharp herb knife from her belt. She straddled his broad chest to keep his thrashing shoulders down. With precise, desperate cuts, she sliced through the thick, blood-stiffened leather straps, securing the mask at the back of his head. She gripped the heavy leather and peeled it away from his flesh. Katie froze. The knife slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the wooden floorboards. The firelight flickered across his face. A brutal, jagged scar ran down his strong jawline, bisecting a fiercely aristocratic, hawk-like profile. It was a face she had seen stamped on wax seals of eviction, sketched onto wanted posters, and burned into the effigies the villagers hung during the darkest, hungriest nights of winter. She hadn't saved a random mercenary. She hadn't even saved the assassin. Lying breathless and vulnerable on her threadbare rug was George Noah, the Iron Duke, the architect of her endless suffering, the monster who had starved her husband to death. Katie slowly reached down and picked up the fallen knife. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the hilt, the metal gleaming in the firelight as she held it hovering just inches over the throat of the man who had ruined her life. The iron edge of the herb knife hovered a hair's breadth from the pulsing vein in George Noah's throat. Katie's hand trembled, the firelight catching the tears tracking through the soot on her cheeks. One swift, horizontal slash. That was all it would take to avenge her husband. That was all it would take to rid the borderlands of the tyrant who had bled them dry. She pressed the blade down just enough to part the top layer of his fever-flushed skin, watching a single, dark bead of blood well up against the dull metal. But the Iron Duke let out a ragged, pitiful breath, his scarred face twisting in subconscious agony. Katie squeezed her eyes shut, a sob catching in her throat. She pulled the knife away, throwing it onto the floorboards with a clatter. "I am a healer," she whispered to the empty, shadows-draped room. "I am no butcher." She turned away, tossing the blood-soaked leather mask directly into the hearth. It hissed and curled, the smell of burning leather masking the scent of sickness in the room. She would treat him, but she would not forget. 2 days later, the fever finally broke. Katie was grinding dried roots in a wooden mortar when a low, gravelly voice shattered the silence. "Where am I?" Katie stiffened. She slowly turned. The Iron Duke was awake, his piercing slate-grey eyes scanning the decaying cottage with guarded intensity. His hand instinctively shot to his face, his fingers grazing the fresh bandages she had wrapped around his lacerated cheek. Panic briefly flashed in his eyes as he realized the mask was gone. He looked at her, his massive frame tense beneath the thin quilts. "Who are you?" "Katie," she answered, keeping her voice carefully flat. "You caught 2 bolts in the back. I pulled them out." He studied her, calculating the risk. "You saved my life." He hesitated, adjusting the scavenged mercenary coat over his broad shoulders. "I am a nameless soldier. Just a sword for coin passing through." Katie held his gaze, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He was lying through his teeth, playing the role of a lowly mercenary to survive. She knew exactly who he was, but she merely nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "Rest then, nameless soldier. The mud has not yet claimed you." Over the next week, the dynamic inside the tiny cottage shifted into a quiet, tense dance. As George regained enough strength to sit up and lean against the stone wall, he began to truly observe the woman who had saved him. He watched her scrape the bottom of a hollow flour barrel, carefully rationing half a wrinkled turnip for herself while boiling the other half into a broth for him. He saw the way she shivered in her thin shawl as she patched the leaking roof with frozen mud. One evening, as the wind howled outside, George looked at the empty chair beside the hearth. "You live alone," he stated, his voice softer than she expected. "I am a widow," Katie replied, not looking up from her mending. "The sweating sickness took my husband 3 winters past." George frowned, the firelight casting deep shadows over his scarred features. "The plague was a tragedy, but a strong man can survive it." Katie finally looked at him, her eyes flashing with a cold, contained fury. "A strong man can survive a fever. He cannot survive starving for 2 years prior, because the Iron Duke demanded our winter grain to fund a war we did not understand." George flinched. The reaction was microscopic, but Katie caught it. The warlord looked down at his calloused, scarred hands, the heavy silence of the cottage pressing in on him. He was looking at the direct, devastating human cost of his decrees, not numbers on a parchment, but a freezing, starving widow who had just spent her last resources to save his life. The fragile peace was shattered the following morning by the heavy thud of hooves and the raucous shouts of men outside. Katie peeked through the warped wooden shutters and felt the blood drain from her face. 6 armored men were dismounting in her muddy yard. Even through the fog, Katie recognized the brutal blackened iron crests painted on their breastplates. They were George's men, the Duke's own soldiers. "Open the door, witch!" a voice bellowed, followed by a violent kick that rattled the cottage hinges. "We know you hide food in there. We'll burn you out and take it from your ashes." Katie spun around, looking desperately at George. He was sitting up, gripping the edge of the table. She expected him to stand tall, throw open the door, and command his troops to stand down with the booming voice of the Iron Duke. She waited for him to reveal his identity and end the nightmare. But George only looked through the cracks in the wood, his slate-grey eyes hardening into a terrifying realization. These men were no longer soldiers. They were feral scavengers, lawless and cruel, enabled by the very war he had orchestrated. If he revealed himself now, weakened and unarmed, they would likely slaughter Katie just to keep the secret of his vulnerability, and then perhaps slit his throat to claim a bounty from his rivals. "Get in the root cellar," George growled, his voice dropping an octave into something primal and dangerous. "Now." "But they are—" "Go!" As Katie scrambled backward and lifted the heavy wooden trapdoor in the floorboards, the cottage door splintered inward with a deafening crash. 3 armored marauders stormed into the room, swords drawn. George did not meet them with a nobleman's steel. He met them with the feral desperation of a cornered beast. Roaring, the Duke hurled the heavy, solid oak table forward, crushing the lead soldier against the doorframe. As the second man lunged, George sidestepped, grabbing Katie's heavy, iron-tined pitchfork from the corner. He drove the wooden shaft up under the man's chin, sending him crashing backward into the hearth. The fight spilled out into the freezing, torrential rain. Peering from the dark cellar, Katie watched in stunned disbelief. The Iron Duke, the most feared man in the realm, was using the deep, treacherous mud of her field to his advantage. He swept a mercenary's legs out with a rusted sickle, sinking his own bare feet into the sludge for balance. He fought brutally, taking a shallow slash to his shoulder, but he did not stop. He fought with farming tools and bare fists, neutralizing the armored threats with the ruthless efficiency of a man fighting for something far more important than a crown. When the last marauder fled into the tree line, coughing up blood, silence returned to the bog. George staggered back into the cottage doorway. He was completely covered in black mud and fresh blood, his breath coming in ragged, painful wheezes. The pitchfork slipped from his bloody fingers, clattering to the floorboards. His eyes rolled back, and the massive warlord collapsed onto his knees before pitching forward into the dirt. Katie slowly climbed out of the cellar, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. She looked at the devastation, at the fallen soldiers, and finally at the giant bleeding on her floor. The tyrant feared by the entire world had just risked his life and fought like a desperate, filthy peasant to protect a widow he believed didn't even know his name. As she rushed forward to press a cloth to his new wounds, Katie realized the terrifying truth. The monster of the borderlands was just a man, and worse, she was beginning to care for him. The fragile peace that settled over the cottage in the following days was heavy with unspoken truths. George's fresh wounds from the marauder skirmish were slowly knitting together, but a deeper, silent tension had taken root between them. Katie tended to him with a gentleness she could no longer disguise as mere survival instinct, and George watched her with an intensity that made the small room feel entirely too warm. The monster of the borderlands had bled to protect her, fracturing everything she thought she knew about him. But the borderlands never allowed peace to linger for long. On the dawn of the 7th day, a different sound pierced the freezing morning mist. It was not the chaotic, drunken thunder of scavenging mercenaries, but the synchronized, rhythmic crunch of heavy iron boots and the disciplined trot of armored warhorses. Katie rushed to the warped window shutters. Through the dense fog, a terrifying silhouette emerged. A dozen elite guards, wearing pristine silver and black plate armor, formed a tight, inescapable semicircle around her muddy yard. At their center sat a man on a magnificent white destrier. He wore fine velvet, trimmed with dark steel, his face sharp and aristocratic, his eyes like polished obsidian. George, standing stiffly behind her, let out a breath that sounded like a death rattle. "Silas," he whispered, the name dripping with absolute venom. Baron Silas. The Duke's trusted right-hand man, the true architect of the region's misery, who had clearly orchestrated the assassination attempt to permanently usurp the dukedom. "Good woman of the house." Silas's voice was smooth, carrying effortlessly through the damp air. "I know who you harbor inside. Step out and I promise on my honor you shall not be harmed." George reached for a heavy iron poker by the hearth, his jaw set. "Barricade the door. I will hold them off. You must slip out the back window into the reeds." "They have the rear surrounded," Katie said, her voice trembling as she spotted silver armor gleaming through the back slats. "If I don't go out, they will burn us both alive." Before George could stop her, Katie threw the deadbolt and stepped out into the freezing mud, pulling her thin shawl tight against the biting wind. Silas looked down at her from his warhorse, a patronizing smile twisting his lips. "You have done a brave thing, peasant, tending to a wounded soldier. But the man bleeding on your floor is not a soldier. He is George Noah, the Iron Duke." Silas paused, feigning a deeply sympathetic sigh. "I know what this monster has done to your village. I know you lost your husband to the starvation he caused." Katie's blood ran cold. She kept her chin high. "And you are here to save us from him?" she spat. Silas chuckled, a dry, lifeless sound. "I am here to execute a tyrant, but you look like a woman who doubts. You think, perhaps, because he is wounded, he is a victim. Let me show you the truth of the beast you nurse." Silas reached into his velvet saddlebag and withdrew a heavy roll of vellum. He tossed it into the mud at Katie's feet. "Read it." Katie picked up the parchment with trembling hands. It was an official decree. Her eyes scanned the elegant, ruthless calligraphy. Requisition of all winter grain stores from the parish of Oakhaven to supply the northern campaign. It was the exact order that had stripped her village bare. It was the document that had sentenced her husband to a slow, agonizing death. And there, at the bottom, stamped in heavy, blood-red wax, was the undeniable crest of the Iron Duke, his personal seal. Katie stopped breathing. The world narrowed to that crimson circle of wax. "He signed it," Silas said softly. "He condemned your husband. Bring him to me, widow, and you shall have gold enough to leave this wretched bog forever." Katie turned on her heel and walked back into the cottage, the parchment crushed in her fist. She closed the door and slid the iron bolt back into place. George stood in the center of the room. He took one look at her shattered expression and the parchment trembling in her hand, and his defensive posture completely crumbled. "You knew," George said, his voice hollow. "You knew who I was this whole time." Katie threw the decree at his chest. It fluttered to the floorboards between them. "Did you sign this?" Her voice was a ragged whisper that held more devastation than a scream. "Did you sign the order that starved my husband?" George looked down at the red wax seal. The lie was right there on his tongue. He could tell her Silas had drafted it, that Silas had manipulated the campaign logistics, that he had never read the specific village names. But looking into Katie's tear-filled eyes, the warlord couldn't hide behind bureaucracy. The seal was his. The absolute power was his. The fault was his. "Yes," George whispered, his broad shoulders dropping as the crushing weight of his crown finally broke him. "I signed it." A sob tore from Katie's throat. The man who had fought like a beast to protect her was the exact same monster who had destroyed her life. The paradox ripped her heart in two. Outside, the undeniable crackle of torches being lit echoed through the damp wood. "Open the door, Katie," George said softly, stepping away from the weapons. He looked at her with an absolute, heartbreaking surrender. "Give me to him. Silas will kill me, and he will let you live. It is what I deserve. Let my death be the last thing I give to you." He was offering himself to the slaughter. The Iron Duke was choosing to die for a peasant. Katie looked down at the parchment on the floor, the ultimate symbol of her agonizing past, of her deepest grief. Then she looked at the heavily scarred, bleeding man standing before her, a man who had just shown her the first true, selfless kindness she had seen in years. The torches flared brighter outside. Silas shouted a final 10-second warning. Katie knelt and picked up the decree. She walked slowly to the hearth. Without a single word, she tossed the heavy vellum into the glowing embers. The fire swallowed the parchment, melting the blood-red wax into nothingness. George stared at her, stunned. "What are you doing? They will kill you!" Katie turned back to him. She reached into the corner and grabbed the heavy, rusted harvesting scythe she had been holding the day she found him. She walked over and shoved the wooden handle hard against his chest. George instinctively gripped the weapon. Katie looked up into the slate-grey eyes of the Iron Duke, her own tears drying in the heat of the fire. "You owe this land a debt, George Noah," she said, her voice ringing with absolute, unshakable steel. "Pay it." George Noah's grip tightened around the splintered wooden handle of the harvesting scythe. The rusted, crescent blade caught the dim, flickering light of the burning parchment in the hearth. He looked at Katie, seeing not a broken, defeated outcast, but the fiercest soul he had ever encountered. She had given him a choice: die as the tyrant they believed him to be, or fight as the man she had saved. With a sudden, explosive surge of power, George didn't just open the door, he kicked it entirely off its shattered iron hinges. The heavy wood crashed into the freezing mud outside, startling the war horses. Baron Silas, sitting comfortably atop his white destrier, sneered as the massive figure emerged from the cottage. But the sneer quickly faltered. George was not wearing the impenetrable plate armor of the Iron Duke. He wore a blood-stained, patched mercenary coat, his bare feet sinking into the freezing muck, and he held a peasant's rusted farming tool. "Kill him!" Silas shrieked, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "Bring me his head!" 4 elite guards dismounted, drawing long, polished broadswords. They charged, expecting to butcher an injured, unarmored man. But they fundamentally misunderstood the battlefield. These men were trained for the stone courtyards of castles and solid earth. George was fighting in the treacherous, sucking bogs of the borderlands, the very mud Katie had dragged him through to save his life. As the first guard lunged, George didn't parry. He dropped low, sliding through the slick sludge, and swung the scythe in a brutal, sweeping arc. The hooked blade bypassed the knight's thick breastplate entirely, catching the back of his armored knee. With a vicious pull, George ripped the man's legs out from under him. The guard crashed face first into the deep mud, the sheer weight of his silver armor pinning him to the earth like an anchor. George didn't stop. He moved with a feral, terrifying fluidity, using the heavy wooden shaft of the scythe to deflect a downward strike before driving the rusted pommel into a second guard's throat. He fought, not with the refined elegance of a nobleman, but with the desperate, raw fury of a man paying a debt of blood. He used the terrain, kicking blinding sprays of freezing mud into the visors of his attackers, tripping them into the deep furrows Katie had dug for her ruined crops. In less than 2 minutes, Silas's elite vanguard was groaning in the sludge, crippled by their own heavy armor and the relentless strikes of a peasant's tool. Seeing his men decimated, Silas spurred his white warhorse, drawing his own gilded sword to strike George down from above. But George stood his ground. As the horse bore down on him, the Duke stepped aside at the last possible fraction of a second, bringing the scythe around. He didn't strike the man. He hooked the horse's heavy leather riding harness. Using the animal's own momentum, George yanked with all his immense strength. The harness snapped. Silas was violently ripped from his saddle, crashing into the freezing mud with a sickening thud. Before the treacherous Baron could even gasp for air, George was standing over him, the rusted, mud-caked tip of the scythe pressed firmly against Silas's throat. The yard fell deathly silent, save for the pouring rain. George looked back at the doorway. Katie stood there, trembling but unbowed, watching the monster she saved become the protector she deserved. 3 days later, the massive iron-wrought gates of the capital keep loomed over the cobblestone streets. The guards stationed at the parapets crossed their halberds as a battered cart approached, only to drop their weapons in absolute, trembling shock. Walking beside the cart, bruised, scarred, but undeniably alive, was George Noah. And riding in the cart, wrapped in the Duke's heavy coat, was a peasant widow. The news swept through the castle like wildfire. Within the hour, the great courtyard was packed with terrified nobility in their silks and bewildered, anxious commoners who had gathered from the lower city. George did not sit on his elevated stone throne in the great hall. Instead, he stood in the center of the muddy courtyard, refusing to change out of his soiled clothes. 2 loyal guards dragged the chained, bruised Baron Silas to the center of the square, forcing him to his knees. The nobility held their breath, expecting the Iron Duke to declare high treason against the crown and demand a gruesome, vengeful execution. "Baron Silas!" George's voice boomed, echoing off the high stone walls. It was not the voice of a tyrant, but of a man awakened. "You are condemned to die this day, but not for plotting against me, not for treason against the crown." George turned, locking eyes with the gathered commoners. You are to be executed for the starvation of Oakhaven. You are to die for the theft of the people's harvest, and for the tyranny inflicted upon the very blood and bone of this land." A stunned, collective gasp rippled through the peasantry. Never in the history of the realm had a nobleman been executed for crimes against the poor. With a single sharp nod from George, the executioner's axe fell. As Silas's body was taken away, George turned to Katie, who stood quietly near the steps. The murmuring nobles expected a cliché, a sudden fairy tale declaration of marriage to elevate the peasant to a duchess to hide her low birth. But George stepped forward and bowed his head to her. "Katie Lucas," George declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the keep. "I do not offer you a title to mask who you are, for who you are is greater than any lord in this court. Your hands saved my life when my own laws sought to end yours." He turned to the crowd. "By my absolute decree, the ancestral herbal law of the borderlands is hereby recognized as the highest medical practice of this realm. Katie Lucas is no longer an outcast. She is the head healer of the Duke's lands, and she speaks with my voice." George reached out, gently taking Katie's calloused, mud-stained hand in his own. "My life," he said softly, yet loud enough for the world to hear, "and the future of this entire reign belong to the mercy of a widow." That evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged mountains, casting a warm, golden glow over the stone parapets, George and Katie stood together on the highest balcony of the keep. Down below, the city was alive with murmurs of change. The crippling fear that had choked the region for a decade was gone, slowly being replaced by the fragile, beautiful seeds of respect. George looked down at the woman who had broken his armor and saved his soul. Katie met his slate-grey eyes, her own reflecting the fading sunlight. No words were needed between them. The Iron Duke and the silent healer shared a long, quiet look, a silent vow that the future of their world would no longer be built on the edge of a sword, but on the unshakable foundation of earned trust. I'm curious how far their journey traveled today. Where in the world are you watching from? Tell me in the comments, and if this tale earned your respect, drop a like, share it, and subscribe with the bell on for our next adventure.